When everything in your life falls apart, when the structures you've built crumble, and the identity you've carefully crafted dissolves into chaos, you might think you're witnessing the end of your story. But what if I told you that every ancient alchemist, staring into their bubbling crucibles centuries ago, would recognize exactly what you're experiencing as the most essential step in any true transformation? What if the very moment you feel most broken is actually when the universe is preparing to remake you into something greater? Hidden in the cryptic motto, solvet coagula, dissolve and coagulate, lies a principle so profound that it explains not just the transmutation of base metals into gold, but the secret architecture of every meaningful change in human existence. This isn't mystical wishful thinking. This is the hidden code that governs how crisis becomes catalyst, how destruction becomes creation, and how the most devastating moments in our lives carry within them the seeds of our greatest breakthroughs. The medieval alchemists who first articulated this principle understood something we've forgotten in our modern rush to avoid discomfort at all costs. They knew that before anything could be purified, elevated, or transformed into its highest form, it first had to be completely dissolved. The gold they sought wasn't created by adding something to base metal. It was revealed by systematically breaking down everything that wasn't gold until only the pure essence remained. But here's what makes this principle so difficult to recognize in our own lives. The dissolving phase feels like pure destruction. When a relationship ends, when a career collapses, when old beliefs no longer make sense, when the person you thought you were no longer fits the life you're living, every instinct screams that something has gone terribly wrong. We interpret these moments as failures, as evidence that we've lost our way, or that life is fundamentally hostile to our happiness. Yet the alchemists would look at these same experiences and see the solve phase in perfect operation. They understood that dissolution isn't random chaos, it's intelligent destruction. It's the precise dismantling of outdated forms to make space for new ones. When your marriage dissolves, it's not just ending. It's revealing which elements of partnership were authentic and which were mere habit or expectation. When your career implodes, it's not just failure. It's the separation of what you truly value from what you thought you should value. This dissolving process has its own wisdom, its own timing, its own necessity. Try to resist it. Try to hold together what needs to come apart, and you'll only prolong the process and intensify the pain. The alchemist learned to work with the dissolution, not against it, understanding that the more completely the old form broke down, the more raw material would be available for the new creation. Consider how this plays out in the great transformations of history. Entire civilizations have undergone this process. The collapse of Rome wasn't just an ending, but a dissolving that released the cultural and intellectual ingredients that would eventually coagulate into the Renaissance. Personal transformations follow the same pattern. The dark night of the soul that mystics write about isn't a detour from spiritual development. It's the solve phase that makes enlightenment possible. What makes this principle revolutionary is how it reframes our relationship to difficulty itself. Most therapeutic approaches, most self-help philosophies Most religious traditions treat suffering as something to be minimized, transcended, or explained away. But Solve et Coagula suggests something far more radical, that certain kinds of breakdown are not obstacles to growth, but the very mechanism of growth itself. This doesn't mean we should seek out suffering or romanticize pain. It means recognizing that when dissolution begins, when the structures of our lives start to liquefy and flow, we're not witnessing a mistake in the cosmic order. We're witnessing the first half of a transformation process that has been operating since the beginning of time. The key insight here is that dissolution and coagulation aren't separate events. They're two phases of a single process. Even while old forms are breaking down, new ones are already beginning to crystallize. But here's the crucial part. The quality of what coagulates depends entirely on how consciously we navigate the dissolving phase. If we resist the breakdown, if we cling desperately to the old forms, if we interpret dissolution as pure loss, then what eventually coagulates will be merely a damaged version of what we had before. But if we can learn to trust the process, to see dissolution as liberation rather than destruction, then what emerges on the other side will be genuinely new, genuinely higher, genuinely transformative. The alchemists called this the philosopher's stone, not because it was a magical object, but because it represented the consciousness that could consciously participate in its own transformation. This is why the most profound personal breakthroughs often come after periods of complete disorientation. The entrepreneur who builds their most successful company after their first venture fails spectacularly. The artist who creates their masterpiece after years of creative drought. The person who finds their truest love after their heart has been completely broken. These aren't coincidences. They're examples of Solve et Coagula operating in human life. Understanding the dissolving phase is only half the equation. The coagulating phase, the reconstitution of new forms, requires its own wisdom, its own skill, its own timing. This is where most people stumble, even when they've successfully navigated the breakdown. They emerge from crisis and immediately try to rebuild their old life, just with better materials or improved circumstances. But this misses the entire point of what they've just been through. True coagulation isn't reconstruction. It's conscious creation from a higher level of understanding. You'll know the coagulation phase is beginning when you notice subtle shifts, new interests arising naturally, different types of people entering your life, or unexpected opportunities that align with values you're just discovering. The person who emerges from divorce isn't meant to find someone exactly like their former spouse, but without the problems. They're meant to discover entirely new capacities for intimacy and partnership. This might show up as suddenly being drawn to deeper conversations, feeling more comfortable with vulnerability, or recognizing patterns in relationships that were invisible before. The person who survives career collapse isn't meant to climb the same ladder more carefully. They're meant to recognize that their relationship to work itself has been transformed. This is where the alchemical metaphor becomes most precise. When you heat lead in a crucible, you don't get better lead. You get an opportunity to work with pure metallic essence that can become anything. But if you don't know how to work with that molten potential, if you just let it cool down randomly, you'll end up with something less organized and less valuable than what you started with. The coagulation phase requires vision, intention, and what the alchemists called the directing intelligence. This isn't willpower or positive thinking. It's a deeper faculty that can perceive the patterns trying to emerge and consciously collaborate with them. Practically, this means paying attention to what energizes you now versus what used to energize you. It means noticing which activities feel like effort and which feel like flow. It means asking not, "What should I do with my life?" but "What is trying to live through me?" The answers often come through your body, through sudden knowing, through doors that open effortlessly when you stop forcing the wrong ones. Watch how nature demonstrates this principle everywhere. The forest fire that seems to destroy everything actually clears the ground for new growth that couldn't have emerged any other way. The caterpillar that dissolves completely in the cocoon doesn't reconstruct itself as a better caterpillar. It becomes something entirely different, something that can fly. But here's what makes Solve et Coagula truly profound as a life principle. It reveals that what we experience as chaos is actually a higher form of order temporarily invisible to us. When your life is in the dissolving phase, when everything seems random and destructive and meaningless, you're actually witnessing the most precise and intelligent process in the universe, the process by which consciousness upgrades itself. This realization changes everything about how we relate to crisis. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" we begin to ask, "What is trying to emerge through this experience?" Instead of focusing on what we're losing, we begin to attune to what we're being prepared to receive. Instead of seeing ourselves as victims of chaotic forces, we begin to recognize ourselves as active participants in our own metamorphosis. The ancient alchemists encoded this understanding in symbols and metaphors because direct description was almost impossible. How do you explain to someone who has never experienced conscious transformation that their worst moments might be their most sacred? How do you communicate that the very experiences they're trying to avoid might contain their greatest gifts? But once you've lived through a complete solve et coagula cycle consciously, once you've seen how dissolution can be followed by reconstitution at a higher level, you begin to develop what we might call transformational sight. You begin to recognize the signs that dissolution is beginning, not with dread, but with curious anticipation. You begin to sense when the coagulation phase is ready to begin, and you learn to work skillfully with the emerging forms instead of imposing your old templates on new realities. This doesn't make the process painless. Dissolution will always involve the death of familiar forms, and that death will always carry grief. But it transforms the meaning of that pain from pure loss to sacred labor, from random suffering to conscious participation in life's creative process. When you're in the depths of dissolution, you can ask yourself, what beliefs about myself am I being asked to release? What roles or identities feel too small for who I'm becoming? These aren't just philosophical questions. They're practical tools for working consciously with the dissolving phase. So what does it mean to live your life in alignment with Solve et Coagula? It begins with developing what you might call transformation literacy, the ability to read the signs of both phases and respond skillfully. When dissolution begins, you might practice what the mystics call holy indifference, neither pushing the river nor building dams, but learning to flow with what's moving. This could be as simple as ending each day by writing down 3 things you're ready to release and 3 things you sense wanting to emerge. When coagulation begins, you practice what we might call conscious midwifery, creating space for new forms to crystallize without forcing their shape. This might look like saying yes to invitations that feel mysteriously important, even when you can't explain why, or following creative impulses that don't make logical sense, but feel vitally alive. When dissolution begins, instead of panic, you cultivate trust. Instead of grasping at the forms that are dying, you practice letting go. Instead of interpreting breakdown as evidence of failure, you recognize it as evidence that you're ready for something greater than what you've known. And when coagulation begins, instead of rushing the process or trying to control its outcome, you practice patience and attention. You learn to sense what wants to emerge and to provide the right conditions for its birth. You understand that the new forms crystallizing in your life are not your creations, but life's creations through you. And your job is not to manufacture them, but to midwife them. Perhaps most importantly, living this principle means recognizing that Solve et Coagula is not a technique to be applied occasionally during major life transitions. It's the fundamental rhythm of consciousness itself, operating at every scale, from the smallest daily disappointments to the largest existential upheavals. Every moment something in you is dissolving and something else is coagulating. Every breath is a tiny death and rebirth. Every sleep is a dissolution of the day self. And every awakening is a reconstitution. The alchemists who first articulated this principle were not trying to turn lead into gold for wealth or fame. They were documenting the process by which consciousness transforms itself into something capable of recognizing its own deepest potential. They understood that the real philosopher's stone was not an object, but a state of being. The consciousness that could find the hidden order in every chaos. The consciousness that could see every crisis as a coded invitation to become more fully yourself. When you understand Solve et Coagula, when you really understand it, not just intellectually, but in your bones, in your cells, in your soul, you realize that there are no accidents, no meaningless suffering, no random disasters. There is only the eternal process of life calling you home to yourself through the very experiences you thought were taking you away from yourself. And that, perhaps, is the greatest magic of all.